Okay, good morning. First of all, I want to thank you, Cammy, for organizing this and bringing me to this site. It's been too long since I was able to discuss all these fascinating topics with people in person. So this is a really kind of special occasion to gather. And I'm going to sort of jump off from Florike over there, but looking into a little bit more of a transhistorical approach, including some practices and looking into historical images. And first of all, I want to have a disclaimer that I am not a botanical artist, not in the most strict sense. I went through art school and then I was trained to draw before I was able to take any sort of major related courses. So during those drawing classes, we were taught to draw pretty much everything, from plants to architecture, actually, to anatomy. So it covered a bunch of different types of grounds, and then we were able to get into more specific sort of topics in illustration. And for my final portfolio, I worked with botanical images. So this was my very first botanical illustration from several years ago. And today, starting with this image, I want to talk a little bit more about information selection and presentation and material and technical considerations. And you will see in this presentation actually more prints than perhaps drawings. But based on what Ulrike just said, prints usually come from some sort of drawing. And because illustration and also how botany was sort of disseminated throughout history, a lot of time was through printed images if people were not within these sort of botanical or humanist scientific network. So what I want to focus on is this sort of process of reproducing a drawing. But first of all, I want to point out what you're seeing here. So when I was first learning how to draw botanical illustration, we were given a bunch of different guidelines. Some of them more material related for watercolor, but basic sort of major rule first is you should always draw from a specimen, a live specimen, not from photo, not from an existing drawing. And you should aim for accuracy. That means proportion, color, plant structure, etc., except for the zoomed in parts. So of course, those are much larger than real life in proportion to the flowers. But the basic idea is that they should be accurate to what we observe. And then the third is that as an illustrator, we have to consider reproduction. So this physical sizing of the image was very important, because if I create a mural piece, if I paint it at this size and I shrink it down to a book that I will then disseminate to other people, much of these details are going to be lost. Whereas if I draw some tiny, tiny image and then I have to blow it up, it's not going to be able to retain that much detail. So the physicality of the images are very important. But I also want to point out a couple of things of what I ended up drawing. So you see, I had a specimen in front of me, and I was very slow in drawing that. So instead of finishing my work in like a week of time, I think I ended up taking the assignment. We had like about 2 weeks to do that. And within that 2 weeks, the bud of the flower bloomed, and then it started to produce these fruit. So over that stretch of time, I started to observe things that I was not planning to draw from the beginning, and ended up having these 3 little things over here. But this workshop gave me a chance to sort of reconsider what is observational drawing, because observational drawing came in a lot of different forms and shapes. And we already saw some very fascinating drawings from earlier that are a little bit more conceptual and abstract. And that is the final piece on the right, but all of these were my observational process. So also, if I was still in art school or a professional artist, I probably wouldn't have been very comfortable showing this because they're not very good in terms of final results. But it shows a lot of different information that I have been processing when starting seeing a bottle bush in a garden in France. That plant captivated me, and I started figuring out what are some of the parts that are more interesting to depict. So the sketch up there, those are not necessarily observational in terms of direct translate what I see to what I ended up drawing, but it was observational in terms of the form, in terms of the growing pattern. but it just is not fashioned in the way that we perceive as observational on paper. And similarly, when it comes to composition, a lot of those was me trying to capture sort of the energy of the plant, the movement of the plant, instead of the details of the plant. But I also have little parts over here that I was trying to figure out, okay, how does that one single fruit or leaf look like? So all of these became like separate compartments and then ended up culminating into the final illustration. And in many ways, I was doing something maybe not very dissimilar to what Gessner was doing, figuring out sort of the plants that he was observing. And that, of course, yields to a lot of information that ended up becoming very important for botany as a discipline through its development. But for the most part, people were not seeing this other than Gessner's network and his colleagues. For other people learning about plants through books, these will be the type of images that people were seeing. So this is from Brunfus, so this is the one painted and then reproduced of Hans Weide's paintings, and then that is Fuchs. So I think the examples Ulrike showed was a little bit better in comparison because they are the same plants, but you can see the difference. Supposedly, they were both done from observation, but the final piece ended up in printed form, ended up having very different stylization, containing a lot of different types of information. And this is what I want to talk about when it comes to selecting information. As you already heard this morning, that drawing is a lot about picking up what you see, and there is it's not objective because you're selecting things that interest you or to sort of present something according to your vision. And in many cases, with botanical illustration, sort of the type of books that they appear, in which they appear, play a very big part of the information selection. So here are two different woodcuts of columbines. And the one on the left, this appeared earlier, so it was already produced in 1568. And the one on the right, this came in about 20 years later in this book. And you see the sort of focus on the different parts started to change. So at first, it was more important to present the plant as a whole, and then showing really the roots, the leaves, and then the flowers. And roots often came in a very important part of these botanical illustrations in herbals, because they often have a lot of medicinal functions. So those information will be present. But these are the type of information that you don't really see in the wild unless somebody sort of dig out the plant and start sort of sorting out the type of information that will be crucial for physicians to really be able to see and visualize in these woodcuts. But then sort of cultivation of plants started to play into sort of the understanding of plants, and people started to focus on different aspects and eventually developed into horticulture as its own field as well. But in this particular time period, they were not as separated, and that's why the double petal columbines on the right, the part where the petals occur is a lot more important for that particular interest, and whereas the root is no longer that interesting for this visualization. But then there are also some quite interesting depictions, particularly when it comes to trees, because it's very difficult to show a big tree in a tiny, tiny woodcut. And when looking into these woodcuts, they're often just the size of my palm. So they are quite small. The amount of information one can get from this tiny picture plan is limited. So you see a lot of these creative sort of problem solution to select only parts of the plant that are critical to the understanding of the use of the plant, and then visualize in a somewhat, just kind of almost comical way. But at the same time, they also have something that was very similar to what I was doing to show how a bud kind of bloom into blossom. And in that case, it shows that they were quite interested in this sort of curving up of the flowers. And that is better shown through 3 different stages instead of just one. So already there are still these fragmented visualizations showing different stages of information as well. But back to the woodcut and back to the size. So seeing these images and knowing the size of them, could be the original sort of model drawing for these woodcuts. Not all of them, but the Libri Picturati, it has quite a large number of drawings ended up becoming woodcuts for the same herbals produced for Rembrandt de Dunes, Carus Crucius, and Matthias Lobelius. So these three botanists were sort of said to be the Netherlandish father of botany, if you will. But the original drawings, these albums are huge. They are a minimum folio size, and each of the albums was kind of bound around this size. So drawings are quite large, whereas the woodcut is still really small. So when shrinking it down, and the mushroom probably doesn't make that much of a difference because it's possible. But when it comes to more complex plants, then a lot of those information needs to be eliminated. And this is the problem when it comes to reproduction. So the image that I painted with our current technology, they can be reproduced more or less close, very close to my original painting. But even then, in the process of scanning the image, cleaning up the background, printing it on different types of paper than the original paper that I painted on, some information will be lost. So now seeing this drawing and how it was reproduced, a lot more information will be lost as well, including the colors. And when it comes to sort of rearrangement, and this is where sort of this idea of copying becomes very important, because a lot of times observational drawing is not just about painting a live plant in front of the artist or the image maker. Oftentimes people were dealing with pressed plants. Sometimes it's really just a model drawing because they were not able to get the specimen. So I think observational drawing, we also have to consider the idea of what is being observed, and oftentimes it might not be the actual specimen. Doesn't mean that they're any less qualified to become sort of the dissemination or important factor in the dissemination of knowledge. But for example, this is kind of like it's called a Collegium. So it's a little bit more just focusing on cultivated and garden flowers, but still has a little bit of a herbal sort of tradition in them with roots being depicted. And this is, again, a huge book. So the information that could be presented is a lot more than like a tiny woodcut. But sort of the making of this series, it's not entirely clear because we also lost a lot of the original drawings. But supposedly there was a set of sort of watercolors or drawings made for this book, observed from nature. And then somebody, one of the maybe engravers or image makers, took those drawings and then rearranged them on the plate to be engraved and ended up having this composition. So that is 2 steps at minimum of sort of translation in quotation that the image has to go through in order for this final image to be disseminated to readers of its time and also sort of preserved until now. And that brings me back to drawing as a practice. And what can we do with drawing as a practice for students, for researchers, anybody really? I think in this case, drawing is not only about what you see and what you select. It is also to make what is lost being more easily to be make one to be a lot more aware of the information that is lost. So in order to draw this tiny drawing over here, from that specimen, I had to pick and choose the part that interests me. But I also noticed a lot of the information that that I was discarding. And I think in using drawing as a practice for research, for understanding the natural world, it is a really important reminder for us to look at historical images of plants and animals and pretty much anything, and then remember that what we see is only a fraction of the reality. And that's the last slide I have.